All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin let's begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank, our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Iyar, Yona Shushie Ehrenfeld for dedicating the shurim this month in memory of their grandfather Yosef ben Shmuel Aron. Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya for dedicating the shurim this month in memory of their dear friend and mentor, Moshe Chaim ben Tzvi Hirsch. Our week of learning sponsors, Hilary Jacobson-Kent, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of her daughter, Shifra, bas Chana Dena, and our Daf Yomi sponsors, Bill Eskin, nishmas, his mother, Gittel bas Nochum, Bernhard and Varda Birnbaum commemorating the 100th yahrzeit of their grandmother. Incredible. Mrs.Esther Oppenheim, Birnbaum Esther bas Hechaver Gavriel Zichrona Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the neshama will have an aliyah and the families a neshama. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is daf pei 80. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Tes Amud Beis 79b. We have a lot to do today, and we left off at the Gemara. Suppose if remember again, I know we did the Mishnah quickly in yesterday's daf, but the Mishnah was focused on the topic of the status of a sris, a person who is sterile. So remember again, whenever we get into this discussion, we always have two different types of srisim that we're talking about, what we call a sris adam versus a sris chama. So a sris adam means sterility caused by injury versus sris chama, a person who is born with a particular condition, or a person who was born sterile. So there was a whole machlokes back and forth in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer, about which one of these types of srisim, which one of these types of individual has the ability to do yibum, or I shouldn't say to do yibum, to do chalitza, and therefore chalitza would be done to us. So there's a whole back and forth. So let's pick up. Says the Gemara, Michti, Shamin Rabbi Akiva, Damar Chayve Lavin, Chayve Krisus Damu, V'chayve Krisus, Lav B'nei Chalitza, V'yibum Ninhu. Supposed to say a little bit of background again. Rabbi Akiva says, here was Rabbi Akiva's explanation in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva said, a sris adam, which means, again, a person who became sterile through an injury, right, during his lifetime, right, over the course of life, he becomes sterile as a result of an injury. Rabbi Akiva said, cholitz v'chotzin le'ishto. Ultimately, again, he does chalitza. In other words, again, if he's a surviving brother, he does chalitza. And ultimately, again, if he passes away without children, chalitza is done to his wife. What's Rabbi Akiva's logic? Because since he wasn't born this way, he had a point in time in which he was kosher, he was fit to marry into the kal, right, to marry into the general assembly, and therefore again, halacha l'maisa, he is subject to the laws of chalitza. So there's laws of chalitza. As opposed to Rabbi Akiva says, as opposed to sris chama, someone who's naturally born that way, ultimately, again, he doesn't do chalitza, nor is chalitza done to his wife. Why? Because he never had a shas hakosher. There was never a point in time where he would have been permitted to marry into the general assembly. Fine, that's the shita of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara asks a fundamental question. Rabbi Akiva says, right? Remember, everyone will say that the famous shita of Rabbi Akiva is that chayve lavin are kechayve krisus. We'll say this is why, again, Rabbi Akiva holds that ultimately, again, you could create a mamzer through chayve lavin, right, which is a pretty dramatic thing. Rabbi Akiva also holds that kiddushin is not tofsin by chayve lavin, that even if you have a relationship punishable just by a lav, kiddushin doesn't take effect. So it says the Gemara, I don't understand. According to Rabbi Akiva, chayve lavin are just like chayve krisus. Well, if that's the case, says the Gemara, if that's the case, then why should there be any chalitza with the wife of a sris chama? All right, of a sris adam. In other words, if a sris adam marries someone abosai, that is a prohibition, right? A man is a sris adam, right? In this case, according to Rabbi Akiva, he suffered some injury. As a result, he's sterile. What do we call this guy? What do we call him? A p'tzudaka krushavcha. In other words, that's the category that he's in. What's the halacha with the p'tzudaka krushavcha? What's the halacha? Lo yava b'kal Hashem. He's not allowed to marry a Jewish woman from the general marriage pool. If he did so, then what? He's transgressed a lav. Now again, for everyone else in the world, that's fine. In other words, it's fine in that halacha l'maaseh he did something wrong, but ultimately, again, the marriage works. The marriage works. So I understand why there could be an issue of chalitza. According to Rabbi Akiva, the marriage shouldn't work because he holds chayvei lavin are like chayvei krisus. And I will say, remember again, going back to the first daf in Yevamos, whenever you have a situation of a chiyuv kares, right, in erva, there is no din of chalitza. So the Gemara is asking Rabbi Akiva, why would there ever be a case of cholzin by sris chama? Fundamental question. Rabbi Ami, Hachama Eskin, what's the case? Kigon shenasa achiv giores. Oh, so we'll say, what's the case? So we'll say, let's say, go back. We haven't had two brothers in a while, right? So you have Reuven and Shimon. We haven't had that, right? Reuven is married to a giores, a convert. Totally fine. He has a brother Shimon. Shimon is a sris chama. He's a sris chama. Now what happens? Reuven passes away. Now we'll say, as much as now, so now we understand why the Mishnah is according to Rabbi Akiva. So Shimon can do chalitza. Why could Shimon do chalitza? Why? Because the P'tzua Daka, Krushavcha, is permitted to marry a giores. They just can't marry into the general pool. That's why he could do it. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yossi, the Amar, Kal Gerim lo Ikri Kal. And Rabbi Akiva holds like Rabbi Yossi, who holds, will say, that the assembly of Gerim is not called the assembly of Klal Yisrael. What does that mean? We have to be very careful. Of course, Gerim are part of Klal Yisrael. But so what it means is like this. When the Torah says, Lo Yavo Bekal Hashem, Kal Hashem means the general pool of Jews who were born Jewish. Kal Gerim is a different grouping. And therefore, again, interestingly enough, the Sris Chama, would be permitted to marry a Giores. Therefore, again, when Reuven dies, Reuven, brother number one, who's totally fine, married, we'll call her Rachel, the Giores, he dies. He has a brother Shimon, right? Shimon is a Sris Chama. Shimon is currently sterile, right? So halacha l'maisa, again, he does chalitza. But how can he do chalitza? He's not shaykh to this woman. Yes, he is, because she's a giores. Well, second, if that's the case, then why do we say Shimon has to do chalitza? What should Shimon be able to do? What should he be able to do? Yibum. Let him do yibum. Let him do yibum, right? Because halacha, we'll say again, remember, just to be clear, a sris, right, falls into the category of P'tzua Daka Krushavcha. P'tzua Daka Krushavcha, they're permitted to marry. They're just not permitted to marry what we call Bikal Hashem, in the general pool. So let them do Yibum. Let them do Yibum if it's a Giores, to which the Gemara says, you're right. The truth is, according to Rabbi Akiva, in this case, he would be able, according to everyone, he would be able to go ahead and do Yibum. Va'aydi dam Rabbi Yoshua choletz, Amar Ihu Nami Choletz. Rabbi Akiva was just maintaining textual symmetry. And since Rabbi Yoshua spoke about Chalitza, therefore Rabbi Akiva also spoke about Chalitza. Dekanami Diktani, Heid Rabbi Yoshua ben Mesera, ben Magusas, Shahaya B'Yushalayim. And we'll say, what's the proof to this? Rabbi Yoshua ben Mesera spoke about this guy, Ben Magusas. That was his name. Ben Magusas was in Yerushalayim. And what happens? He was a Sris Adam. The Yibmo as Ishto lekaimis of Rabbi Akiva, and they allowed him to do Yibum in accordance with the position of Rabbi Akiva. Now I will say, when can you ever have a situation of a Sris Adam who is permitted to go ahead and do Yibum? When could that ever happen? Interestingly enough, according to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva holds that Sris Adam had a point in time when he was permitted, okay, and it must be a case where what? The deceased brother was married to a Giores, and the Sris Adam, who is considered to be like a Krushavcha, P'tzua Daka, is and by the way, one more piece, and we assume that Kal Gerim is not called Kal Hashem. In that case, ultimately, again, the surviving brother, who is the Sris Adam, would be permitted to do Yibum. Okay, all I need is a couple of things to align perfectly, right? And the case works. But the point is, the case works. Incredible. So we'll say a very important development in our Gemara. Let's go right to massive Rabba. So Rabba raises a kasha. So we'll say, so just to point out over here like this, we're laser focused on Sheitas Rabbi Akiva. So just let's go through this again. Rabbi Akiva said in our Mishnah that a Sris Adam has the ability to go ahead and do chalitza. A Sris Chama does not. Why the distinction? Because according to Rabbi Akiva, a Sris Adam had a point in time in which he was fit, right? Because he wasn't born this way. Versus the Sris Chama, who never had what we call a Shasa kosher, a point in time where he would have been eligible for this. Okay, so then the Gemara just builds on this. But Rabbi Akiva, the ability for even a Sris Adam to marry someone would be a lav. So how is he even in the parsha? And you hold that lavim are like chayve krisus. How would he ever be in the parsha of chalitza? To which the Gemara says, you're right, it only works in a specific case, which is what? His sister-in-law is a giores. And Keirim are not called Kal Hashem, they're their own group, and therefore halacha l'maaseh, that's the situation where he could do chalitza. The truth is, he could even do yibum. He could even do yibum in that case, but we just call it chalitza to maintain symmetry. Okay, now, massive Rabba raises the kasha. Petzua daka krushavcha. So we'll say if you have a petzua daka or a krushavcha, sris adam, or a person who's a sris adam, right? Vahazokin, or someone who's old. Now, we'll say we're grouping all of these people together. You'll see why in just a moment. So what's the halacha? So we'll say, so obviously the common denominator in all of these people is they can't father children. That's the idea. They can't have children. So the Gemara says, so o cholzin o miyabmin. They could either do chalitza or they could do yibum. Says the Gemara, o cholzin o miyabmin. I'm sorry. Good. Kate, so we'll say, what's the case? It's actually very interesting. What's the case? So mesu, if these individuals, right? Mesu v'lahem nashim v'lahem achim. If they died, right? These men died, and let's say they left behind widows. So we'll say, so all of these men now in this case were married. They left behind widows, or any one of these cases. They left behind a widow, and they also have, and no children, obviously. They also have surviving brothers. And let's say one of the surviving brothers gets up and does, or the surviving brother gets up and does maimar, right? V'nosnu get, or gives a get, or shechalzu, or they do chalitza, masha asu. What's done is done. V'im ba'alu kanu. And if their surviving brother had bia with the widow, ultimately again it works. It works out tzibum. Meisu achin va'amduhein. Both say, what about the flip side case? If you have any of these men, and any of these men had a brother, and the brother died without children, right? So what's that? Meisu achin va'amduhein va'asu ma'imar b'nishosein. And then these individuals listed over here, both say the Petzuadaka, Krushavcha, Srus Adam, and the Zakein, and then they did ma'amar with his sister-in-law, or Nasnu get, gave a get, oh Chaltzu, or did Chalitza, Masha asu. First one line, I'll say, Badim Avam Ayin Tes. What's done is done. Ve'im ba'alu kanu. And if any of these men did yibum, ultimately again it would work. Va'asala kaimon. However, again, they are not permitted to remain married. So it's an interesting case. If any of these men did in fact do yibum, the yibum would be effective, but they would not be permitted to maintain the marriage. Why? Mishum shenamar lo yavo petzuadaka o krushavcha bekal Hashem. So we'll say ultimately, again, the Torah says petzuadaka krushavcha cannot come bekal Hashem. Then I both say the Gemara says therefore alma bekal askinon. Then I both say so. Just to understand what happened over here, right? Let's just analyze this case for just a moment. You have all these individuals, right? Petzuadaka, krushavcha, sris adam, and zakein. We're grouping them all together. Okay, what did we just say? We just said that halacha l'maaseh. Let's go to the second case, because that's really the kasha. So we'll say, these men, what happened? They have a brother, right? The brother died, left behind a widow. What did the Brisa just say? If any of these men did yibum with their sister-in-law, what's the status of the yibum? It works, but they're not allowed to remain married. Why? Because the Torah says lo yav b'kal Hashem. And I both say, if we are utilizing, or if we are bringing up the isser of lo yav b'kal Hashem, that means who is their sister-in-law? Or who is not their sister-in-law? Or what is their sister-in-law not? Right? A giores. Because again, the isser of lo yav b'kal Hashem doesn't apply to a giores. The fact that the Brisa is bringing this up indicates that they're doing yibum with a sister-in-law who is not a giores, but ultimately, again, just a regular Jewish woman. And again, ultimately, we're saying that what? It works. But according to Rabbi Akiva, it shouldn't work, because this type of yibum would be an Isra Lav. According to Rabbi Akiva, an Isser Lav has the same status as a Isser Kares, and Yibum is not effective in a case of an Isser Kares. So this is Rabbos Kashan Rabbi Akiva. Ela Amar Rabba, Kegon Shenafla Lo, Ubasof Nifza. We'll say, okay, so here's the case, and actually everything makes a bit more sense. Rabbi says, what's the case? The case of this Brisa is talking about a situation where halacha l'maisa, right, brother dies, then their surviving brother, and then surviving brother becomes a sris. Remember again, this is sris Adam. So in other words, at the moment that the brother died, and the zika, which a word we haven't used in a little while, right? The zika was created, surviving brother was eligible to perform yibum. Then an event occurs afterwards, and then he becomes a sris Adam. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Naflalo v'huzkika liyibum. Right, I will say again, zeka. The zeka is created. Ulubasof niftzor. Rashi says, Dahashta baye chalisat kwe zeka. I will say that's the case. So Rabbi is suggesting that perhaps this is the general situation in which Rabbi Akiva would require chalitza, right? This is the situation of chalitza. Salacha l'maisa, again in a situation where brother died, surviving brother was 100% eligible to perform yibum. Therefore, again, the zika connection is created. Then he becomes a sris adam, petzuadaka, krushavcha, whatever it might be. In that case, there is a zika that is still upon him. Then I both say, now granted, can he carry through on the zika? No, because now there's a lav upon him. But the zika is still there. Therefore, chalitza is going to be necessary to take care of the zika. Incredible. Amarli Abai said, 1 second. But why? In other words, I will say, I just want to tell you, this is just so fascinating. So just to isolate this one case. So according to Rabbi Akiva, here's what's happening. Ruvain dies, right? Ruvain is married. Ruvain dies, leaves behind a widow. No complication. But I'm saying no complications from a Yibum perspective. There's Shimon, one surviving brother. Shimon is a great guy, eligible, no problem, right? So we'll say we already know the moment Ruvain dies, what happens? Zika bond is created. Okay, now what happens? Shimon suffers an injury. And as a result of Shimon's injury, he now becomes a sris Adam. So I will say now what Rabbi Akiva is saying is like this. So what does Shimon have to do? Chalitza. Can't do yibum. Why can't he do yibum? He's with tzudaka. Lo yava b'kal Hashem. He can't marry this woman, right? Maybe if she was a yores, perhaps. But as soon as she's not right, can't do anything because ultimately, again, right? Lo yava b'kal Hashem. But yet there's still the zika. The zika's there. So therefore, Allah Kalamaisa, we require chalitza. To which the Gemara says, I don't understand. Leise isser patsua v'nidche aseh di yibum. Why? Why don't we just say at this point in time there's no more zeka? Why is there no more zeka? Let the prohibition of Petzua Daka uproot the asay of Yibum. In other words, we're both say, what do you mean there's a zeka? A zeka is only meaningful if there's a possibility of Yibum. But halacha l'maisa over here, once he becomes a sris Adam, now he has upon him a lav. Lo yavo b'kal Hashem. So he can't do Yibum. So let that lav uproot the zeka. To which the Gemara says, Milo Tanan, after all, did we not learn? Rabbi Gamliel Omer, im miyana, ve'im lav, tamtin ad shetagdil, ve'teitze halazum mishum achos isha. So remember again, we actually had this case where, remember again, you have two brothers, Ruvain and Shimon, and let's say they're married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah. But Shimon's wife, Leah, is a ketana. So let's say again, the father, right, Leah's father, married her off to Shimon. So Shimon is married to a ketana. They say, remember again, actually, I'm sorry, not her father, her brother. Let's call it her brother, right? Therefore, again, it's Kiddushay Dirabanan. Ruvain dies. Rachel now falls before Shimon for Yibum. What's the problem? Could Shimon do Yibum? No. Why? Because then he'll be effectively married to two sisters. So the easiest thing is we tell Leah, who is the rabbinic wife, do miyun, do miyun. Mio, right, refuse the marriage. That allows her to retroactively uproot the marriage. And then Shimon could do yibum. But ultimately, again, if Leah does not want to do miyun, then we wait till she gets older, right? She then becomes a full-fledged biblical wife, in which case, again, Shimon doesn't have the ability to do yibum, or there's no obligation to yibum or chalitza with Rachel. Why? Because Achos Ishto, blast from the past, right? Achos Ishto is his wife's sister. So we see, what does that effectively do? That goes ahead and allows the Isra of Achos Isha, to uproot the obligation of Yibum. So the Gemara says, Alma Asi Isra Achos Isha, V'dachi, Hachanami Neisei Isra Patsua, V'nitchi. So we'll say we should see over here that halacha l'maisa, the moment that Shimon becomes ultimately again a Sris Chama Patsua Daka, that Isser should come and uproot the assay of Yibum. Amrav Yosef, Haitana Hachtana de Rabbi Akiva. Truth is, Gemara answers, the Tana of our Mishnah is, or we'll say apparently there are two versions of Rabbi Akiva. Our version, our Tana of Rabbi Akiva says, the Amar Mechayve Lavin de She'er Have Mamzer. The Rebbe say the only type of lavin that create mamzerus are the type of lavin that have to do with relationships with people who are related to you. However, mechayvi lavin greedy lo havi mamzer. Ultimately, I will say, but by stam chayvi lavin, ultimately this version of Rabbi Akiva would not create mamzerus. Okay, fine. I will say, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the Gemara is suggesting that halacha l'maisa therefore will work. Okay. Ikri kan, so we'll say two versions in Rabbi Akiva. Ikri kan lahakim la'achiv shem. So we'll say we see over here ultimately again by Yibum, right? The pasuk by Yibum says, the pasuk is actually talking about by chalitza. We speak on the idea lahakim la'achiv shem. We'll say the entire point of Yibum is to go ahead and establish offspring in memory of the deceased brother. I says the Gemara v'hai lav bar hachihu. So we'll say, let's go back for just a moment, because the Gemara is intrigued that the Sris Adam would have an obligation in Yibum, or I should say in Chalitza, right? But why is he even in the Parsha at all? After all, halacha l'maisa, the obligation of Yibum / Chalitza is what? To establish offspring for the deceased brother. This brother who is a Sris Adam is unable to do any of that. So halacha l'maisa, why is he even in the Parsha? To which the Gemara says, V'hayla barachi, Amarava imkein ein lecha isha shekshera liyavam shelo naaseh ba'ala sris chamasha achas kodem lemisaso. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Rabbi says, well, if that's the case, then the truth is no woman should ever be subject to yibum. Why not, Rabbi say? Now listen to this. Remember, let's go back for just a moment. If a woman was married to a Patsua Daka or a Krush Shafcha, right? I will say, ultimately, again, would she be subject to Yibum? And the answer is no. Why? Because if she could not have children with her now deceased husband, ultimately, again, there's no mitzvah of Yibum. So the Gemara says, Rava says something amazing. I will say, we assume that a man, a few moments before his death, becomes what we call a Sris Chama. We'll say, what does that mean? That now, if the Gemara is presupposing that a person is dying of old age, right? Or a person is dying of natural causes, so we assume that they're so weak before they die that they don't have the ability to father children, right? That would be called this, but again, it's natural causes because it's just the aging process, right? Death. So every person before their death would be called a Sris Chama. If that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, no woman should ever be subject to Yibum, because halacha l'maisa, she's being widowed from a man who was incapable of having children. To which the Gemara says the Rabbi Eliezer, Piruka de Rabba Pirchahi. Also, according to Rabbi Eliezer, do we say that the answer of Rava is in fact the question Hasam Kechishusa da Aschalebe? Ultimately, Rabbi will say the truth is no. A man a few moments before he dies is not called the Sris Chama. At most, what that's called is physiological weakness. There's a difference between a weakness which prevents you from having children versus a form of sterility. Those are two very different things. So a man, a few moments before he dies, perhaps is suffering from weakness, but lamaisa, that's not sterility. So the Gemara will say, now we get into definitions. So we'll say this entire conversation was really just focused on the position of Rabbi Akiva. Now we're kind of gonna go zero out a little bit. I will say, what is the case? How do you define the condition of a sris chama? I will say, here's what the Gemara is really asking. The Gemara is asking, are there physical indicators that would allow us to know that a man is sterile before he gets married? So we'll say, typically we would assume, how do you know if a man is sterile? How do you know if a man is sterile? Right? He gets married and he doesn't have children. Now, even that's imprecise. Right? Why? Because if he's married, he doesn't have children, how do you know if it's the man? How do you know if it's the woman? How do you know if it's the combination of the two? So what the Gemara is asking over here is, are there any physical indications before a man gets married that he may be a sris chama? So I will say, here's what's interesting. See, in a sris adam, you might be able to know that he's a sris adam, right? How do you know? That's the result of an injury, right? A guy is a petzua daka, a guy is a krushavcha. Those are physical injuries that you know. Over here we're talking about, again, sris chama means a man is naturally sterile. So are there any indications? Here we go. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rav Yochanan, kol shelo top of pay, kol shelo ra sha'achos b'kashruso. So we'll say, it's interesting. So the Gemara says, what's the definition of a sris chama? Sris chama is a man who was born sterile. Okay, I got it. But menaya dinan, how would he know? In other words, are there any physical indications? I'm Rabbi, and I will say, again, before we go on to this, I just want to point out, I give this disclaimer every time, whenever the Gemara talks about medicine, right? Medicine is just reflective of whatever was going on during that time. In other words, the medicine that we have in the Gemara, right, is not halacha. It's not halacha. It's Chazal's medicine, which again was the generally understood medical conventions. Here we go. It's interesting. So the Gemara says, if when a man urinates, if there's no arc to the urination, but instead, ultimately, again, the urine kind of just goes down, right? It just, in other words, it just kind of like just drops down. There's no, really what it's saying is there's no force to it. So there's no arc. It just trickles down. Ultimately, again, that's an indication of sterility. To which the Gemara said, by the way, now these are congenital defects. So how does that happen? The Gemara says, what happened? In other words, it's so interesting. The Gemara is assuming something must have happened in utero that must have caused this. So what could cause this? Mimai havi, listen to this. The afye ime betira, the shasya shechra marka. This could come from the mother baking bread during high noon and drinking watered down beer. First of all, nothing good ever comes from drinking watered down beer, right? That's olive, right? Let's say, but over here, what's interesting is the Gemara attributes this to two things. Baking during high noon, which means during pregnancy she was exposed to intense heat, right? Because it's baking, oven is hot, high noon, right? Ultimately, again, the heat. And again, Shifra Marka, I don't know. Rashi says, Shikar Mazug, V'ikad Shikar Mazug, V'ikad Armi Chazak. So we'll say Rashi gives two gersos. Shikra Marka could either mean diluted beer or exceptionally strong beer. Okay? Either way, the Gemara understands this combination to cause sterility. So the Gemara says, good. The Amar Rav Yosef, Hanu dishamana la'ami da'amar kol shemimei imo likui velo yadana mai nihu v'leichosh shemehivri ben saim. So says the Gemara. So Rabbi Yosef said, this is what Rabbi Ami used to say, that the definition of a sris chama is someone ultimately, again, definite as someone who was afflicted this way already from the womb. In other words, he was born with a state of sterility. So the Gemara says, "V'leichosh shema hevri bein sayim." This is interesting. I will say, maybe the man, maybe he experienced a period of time where he wasn't sterile. In other words, here's what we know. We know what he is right now, and perhaps we even know that he was born that way, for argument's sake, right? Because let's say from the beginning, right? Whenever he urinated, there was never the urination with the ark. Let's assume for a moment that that's a sign. So maybe there was a period in time where he was healed. Then I will say, why does that matter to us if he was healed and then afflicted again? I will say, because what does that do if he was healed and afflicted again? Ultimately, again, the Gemara says that would make him into a what? Potentially a sris adam and not a sris chama. And I want to say, according to Rabbi Akiva, a sris adam is treated more leniently than a sris chama. So the Gemara says, no. Kevan de tchilasa v'sofa lokoi lo chayshina. Oh, so we assume that if he was born this way, and now before us he is this way now, we assume that that has been his maintained state throughout his lifetime. In other words, we'll say, we don't assume that there was a period of time in which he was healed. To which the Gemara says, Masir Rav Mari, is that true? So, Masir Rav Mari, Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus Omer, Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus says, both can also shalosh pamim b'soch shmonim yom. So we'll say it's interesting, totally unrelated topic. Bechar behema. We'll say if the bechar develops some water on the eye, or white spots on the eye. These are mumin that would go ahead and invalidate a bechar offering. So says the Gemara something amazing. What do? We check the bechar animal 3 times over the course of 80 days to see if these mumin went away. I will say, what's the point of it? What do you see? What do you see from here? That it is possible that sometimes an animal, at least an animal, has a mum. The mum heals, the mum comes back. So we see it is possible for a mum to heal. So why aren't we concerned that even if this individual was born in a state of sterility, perhaps halacha l'maisa, again, it was healed in the interim, to which the Gemara says, no. L'chat ivre chashinon, l'kule gufa lo chashinon. I'll say there's a big difference. When there's a mum in a particular limb, that there's the possibility that maybe it was healed, right? When it came back again, left again, that we have to look for. But Lamaisa, when it comes to what we'll call, a systemic issue, right, or a holistic issue, which is what sterility is categorized as, we assume that a state like that does not vacillate, it does not change, and therefore, again, if he's been established ultimately as a sris chama, that state remains with him. Incredible. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, low key. So also remember again, Rabbi Eliezer came along and said, he said just the opposite. He argued Rabbi Akiva. And he said a sris chama does chalitza. Ultimately, again, why? Because according to Rabbi Eliezer, a sris chama can be healed. As opposed to a sris adam, ultimately, again, who does not do chalitza. Why? Mipnei she'ein lo refuah. There's no healing for him. So it says the Gemara, let's analyze this. Or minhu, raise a kasha, but say, interesting case. Ben esrim shana v'lo hevi shtei sa'aros. But say, listen to this case. Let's say you have a man who's 20 years old, and he never brought any signs of physical maturation. Shtei saros, never had 2 heirs. Right? So again, I will say, 20 years old, no signs of physical maturation. What's the halacha? Yaviu raya shuhu ben esrim. He should bring a raya, right? He has to bring a raya of his age. It's interesting, he has to bring a raya that he's 20 years old. V'hu asris, and now we establish that this guy is a sris. Now, both say, I just want to point out something amazing. When someone is older but has not developed signs of physical maturation, there's 2 possibilities. What are the 2 possibilities? Possibility number 1 is he's just a late bloomer, right? That's possibility number 1. Just a late bloomer. Possibility number 2 is that he's a sris. Now, I will say, what's the nafkamina? There is a fascinating nafkamina. If he's a late bloomer, then it could be that he could have the status of a katan for an advanced, until an advanced biological age. If he's a sris, then it turns out that what? He was really a gadol as of when? The age of 13. Fascinating. We're going to see this inside. So says the Gemara, let's analyze. Says the Gemara, good. I'm sorry. Ultimately, again, I will say he doesn't do chalitza and doesn't do yibum. Bas esrem v'lo yaviyeh. So if you have a woman who's 20 years old, but she has not gone ahead and brought any signs of physical maturation. I will say the case would be over here where she's married to someone, now she was widowed. We're going to see this in just a moment. Yavirai she bas esrem. Ultimately, again, she should bring a raya that she's 20 years old. V'hiya islandess, and I will say she's an islandess. And therefore, again, lo choletzes v'lo misyavemes. Ultimately, again, she doesn't do chalisa, doesn't do yibum, divrei Beis Hillel. So we'll say Beis Hillel is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and we wait until the age of 20. If by the age of 20, the man or the woman have not brought any signs of physical maturation, we designate him as a sris, we designate her as an islandess, and therefore, again, Rabbi say no chalitza, no yibum, no nothing. Rabbi Shammai says no. Zeh v'zeh b'shmon esrei. So Rabbi say, Beis Shammai agrees in principle that obviously after a certain point in time where there are no signs of physical maturation, then halacha l'maisa, again, you'll have to designate as an islandess or a sris. He just disagrees on the age. And he holds the age is not 20, the age is 18. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer HaZachar Kedivrei Beis Hillel, or Nekeva Kedivrei Beis Shammai. Rabbi Eliezer has a hybrid. He holds by men, we paskin like Beis Hillel, i.e. 20 years old, and by women, 18 years old. Why the distinction? Because everyone knows women physically mature earlier than men. Good. So we'll say that's Rabbi Eliezer's position. Amar Rami Bar Dikuli Amar Shmuel Chazer Bo Rabbi Eliezer. Ultimately, Rabbi Eliezer ultimately retracted. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. I'm sorry. Amar Shmuel Chazer Bo Rabbi Eliezer. Ultimately, Rabbi Eliezer retracted this position because we'll say, remember again, this is different than Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah, contrary to Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah. That's why the whole thing is brought as a kasha. Ultimately, again, Shmuel, the Rami Bar Dikuli, name of Shmuel said, Rabbi Eliezer recanted. Fine. Ibailahu. Mahi, so the Gemara says, Mahi Haderba. I will say, so which position did Rabbi Eliezer recant? The one quoted over here or the one of the Mishnah? To which the Gemara says, Tashma, the Sanya, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, Sris, Chama, Choletz, V'chotzin Le'ishto. Oh. So we'll say the Brisa says, Rabbi Eliezer says, a sris chama, ultimately again does chalitza, and ultimately again, if he dies, we do chalitza for his wife. Why? Shekim b'minon misrapin b'Alexandria shel Mitzrayim. Rabbi say this is fascinating because Rabbi Eliezer says in Alexandria they had fertility doctors. Incredible. Alexandria they had fertility doctors, and they could treat. We'll call this congenital infertility, right? They could treat that. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, to which the Gemara says, so we'll say, so therefore again, it sounds like Rabbi Eliezer ultimately again held by his position in the Mishnah and retracted the position in the Brisa, to which the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, the Olam lo haderbei, v'chi tnanahi la'onshin. To which the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Eliezer really never retracted his position. And ultimately again, when Rabbi Eliezer said before, that the halacha, Rabbi Eliezer said before, that the halacha follows Beis Hillel, ultimately again, for 20 years old for a man, that was ultimately stated legabe what? That was stated legabe onshin. That was stated in terms of punishment. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, almost right across, V'chi tnan hahi, hazachar kedivrei Beis Hillel, lav Amay da amri lo choleis el ashrinan da'ad shei ben esrim chashrinan le katan im lo hevi umikan ve'ela chamrinan gadol hu im lo hevi ela shu sris v'chai bonshin. But what Rabbi was saying was like this: when we say that halacha follows Beis Hillel, that from the age of 20 and on is called the sris. Rabbi say what that means is like this: up until the age of 20 we treat him like a katan. From the age of 20, now that we realize he has not brought any signs of physical maturation, he's a sris. But Rabbi say a sris is a gadol. So from the age of 20 and on, ultimately he'll be treated like a gadol. Okay? To which the Gemara says, Itmar, achal chelev mi ben shtem esrei v'yom echad ad ben shmona esrei. So we'll say if a person ate chelev from the age of 12 until the age of 18, v'noldu bo simani sris. And I will say then at the age of 18, a person, right, the simanim of a sris, which I will say, so far we only spoke about one by a man, which ultimately is that the urine doesn't arc, right? The flow of the urine doesn't arc, but we're going to see other simanim right now. So what happened? In other words, you had a person transgressing a prohibition from the age of 12 until the age of 18. Eating chelev. So I'll say, right? And then what happens? At the age of 18, so it becomes clear that halacha l'maisa, the person is a sris. Now I'll point out Rashi, very important Rashi. Mi ben yud beis al ben yud ches. You see that Rashi? Atinokes koi Rabbi Eliezer da'amar nekeva kebeis Shammai u'mereisha mishamin alei dekamer yud beis yom echad. I just want to point out Rashi says even though the Gemara sounds like it's talking about a man, in fact it's talking about a woman. That's why it uses the age of 18. Because remember again, Rabbi Eliezer said that halacha follows beis Shammai by a woman, and ultimately again she's determined to be an islandess or a sris at the age of 18 if she displays no signs of physical maturation. So we'll say, here's the case. You have a woman who was eating chelev. That's just the example. She was doing something prohibited between the ages of 12 and 18. And I will say, what's unique about 12? That's the age in which she would have normally been assumed to be an adult. But she doesn't develop physically. Now she's 18 and still no signs of physical maturation. Right? And I will say, now watch this. Ula'achar mikan hevi shtei saros. And I will say, interestingly enough, afterwards, after the age of 18, then sometime afterward, then she develops 2 hairs. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha? Rav Amar Na'aseh Sris Lemafreya. Rav says she has the retroactive. Rabbi say there's 2 things happening over here. The first thing the Gemara is not dealing with, which is Rabbi say something absolutely amazing, which is after you pass a certain age and have not developed physically, even if there are subsequent signs of physical maturation, halachically, they don't matter. So we're going to see this more in Amud Beis, but essentially, once you pass that age of 18 and there's no signs of physical maturation, even at 19, if she develops 2 hairs, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. She has the designation of a Swiss or an islandess. We'll discuss why that is. But we're leaving it on the side right now. We'll say the shaila is now she reaches the threshold of 18, no signs of physical maturation. She's an islandess. What do we do about her status? Rav says, Nasa Sris Lemafreya. It turns out that Rabbi say now retroactively we establish her as a Sris, which Rabbi say means what? As of the age of 12, she was a Gedola. She's an adult, and therefore again Rabbi say she's just an islandess, right? But she's an adult, and therefore again she has liability for what? All of the chaylev she ate between 12 and 18. Shmuel says no. Katan haya ba'osasha. Shmuel says no. Essentially, we treat her like a kitana up until the age of 18. And at 18, when we declare her an islandess, then she's an adult from that point forward. Maskif Rav Yosef Rav. So Rav Yosef raised the kash. Rabbi say, just fascinating machlokas. So Maskif Rav Yosef Rav. Islandess Rabbi Meir Yehela Knas. So Rabbi say, an islandess, according to Rabbi Meir, ultimately, again, there should be a knas. Right? That Allah Chalamais, again, if you violate an islandess, ultimately there should be the penalty payment. Amalei Abai and Rabbi say, yet Rabbi Meir holds that there's not a knas. If you take a look, let's go right there. Says the Gemara, Amalei Abai mikatnusa yatzes sala beggar. So Abai says it must be that by an islandess, Rabbi say, that there's an interesting thing. By normal maturation of a girl, there's 3 stages. There's kitana, nara, and bagros. By an islandess, ultimately, again, we skip the step of kitana and ultimately transition immediately into bagros. Fascinating. Again, we'll discuss all these details. So he said to him, the truth is, all of these things, all of these incredible teachings were really conveyed to us originally by Shammai. This Sanya. Rabbi say, here we go. We learned in a Braisa. Ein sris nidon ki ben sora mora. Rabbi say, listen to this. A sris can never be a ben sora umora. He can never be judged as a sora umora. Why not? Lefi she'ein ben sora umora nidon ela ke chasimas zakan atachton. Because I will say ben sora umora must display signs of physical maturation. If he doesn't have signs of physical maturation, he cannot be judged. Ve'ein islandess nidonis kinara murasa. Similarly, again, I will say an islandess cannot be judged as an amurasa. What's an nara amurasa? Namurasa is a nara, which is the age between 12 and 6 months, who was betrothed to a man and had relations with another man. She committed adultery. Nara has unique halacha. An islandess can never be judged as a nara amurasa. Why not? Because I will say an islandess has no naros. She's never a nara. She goes right from katnus up until bagros. Amr Rabbi Simani Sris va'ailenis uben shmona. Simani Sris va'ailenis uben shmona. Ein osan bahen maisa ad shiu ben esrim. So we'll say the Gemara says, Rabbi Avo says, if you have a man or a woman who display signs of being a Swiss or an islandess. So we'll say the truth is, what are the signs of being a Swiss or an islandess? Right now, all we know is that what makes a Swiss or an islandess is the lack of physical maturation. We're going to see that there are other active signs as well. Or I will say a baby born during the 8th month. So you have to understand, from a Talmudic perspective, a baby born during the 7th month was viable, during the 9th month was viable, during the 8th month was not viable. So any 3 of these people, a child born during the 8th month, right, a man who may be a Sris, a woman who may be an islandess, we wait until the age of 20 to determine their status. To which the Gemara says, because we'll say, then, again, remember, because if by 20, if the man doesn't physically develop or the woman doesn't physically develop, then what? We know that what? They're a Sris. And we judge them. In other words, and their status is determined accordingly. And I will say, it seems to be also that a baby born during the 8th month is only considered to be viable once he reaches the age of 20. It's pretty good viability. So we'll say, it's interesting of the Gemara said, 1 second, Uben Shmona Mika Chai, does an 8th month baby survive? it doesn't survive. Vatanya, ben shmona hariu ke'even. I will say baby born during the 8th month is like a stone, meaning what? I will say va'asla taltalo. That baby is muktzah on Shabbos. Right? I will say, why is that baby muktzah on Shabbos? Ultimately, again, because that baby is considered to be totally non-viable. Totally non-viable. However, aval ima shocha alava minikaso. Ultimately, again, his mother could bend down over him and nurse him amud beis mipnei sakana. Ultimately, again, because of the danger both to the mother and the baby, Rashi points out. The mother needs to nurse also. We'll say, the point over here is, leaving aside the Hilchos Shabbos, you see from halacha that an 8-month-old baby is considered to be totally non-viable. Eskin, we'll say, what's the case over here? Keshegamru simanov. Oh, interestingly enough, the case I will say is where the 8-month baby ultimately, again, is born fully formed. Fully formed. This sanya, because we learned, Ezu ben Shmona, how do you know an 8-month-old baby? Ultimately, again, any baby who's did not go the full gestational period. Rabbi says, Simanim mochichin alav. You could actually tell an 8-month baby by looking at it. How so? Sa'aro v'tziparnav shelo gamru. Its hair and its nails are not fully complete. Not fully complete. TALMUD lo gamru. The reason, ultimately, we know it's an 8-month-old baby, or when I say 8-month-old, you understand 8-month gestational period, right? So the Gemara says, "Tamid lo gamru, ha gamru amrinan, hai barzayinu v'ishtahui udishtai." Was interesting. If the hair and the nails are complete, we say that what? We say that halacha lamaisa is really a 7-month baby who just hung around for another little bit. In other words, I will say that interestingly enough, and again, I will say this is all reflected. By the way, Dr. Langman was not here today, but when we had this Gemara last time, we've had this Gemara a number of times, he was explaining to me that something does happen in the 8th month of pregnancy. There's something unique that does happen in the 8th month that ultimately, again, leaves the child more susceptible to infant mortality. All right, I'll have to ask him and come back to the shir. I will say, so point over here is interesting. Chazal had this idea that it could be that you have a 7th-month baby. A 7th-month baby is a baby that's ready to go after 7 months, right? Expedited, rush service, right? So the baby is ready to go after 7 months. So if you have a baby that comes out in the 8th month, but its hair and its nails are complete, that's really a 7th-month baby that just stuck around for another little while in the womb. But ultimately, again, its formation was already finished at the end of 7 months. So the Gemara says, is a wild case. Listen to this. What about the following case? Rabbi Tosfa to the following thing. Listen to this case. There was a woman whose husband went on travel. He was overseas, right? And ultimately, again, he was gone for a year. And the year after, right, pretty much a year after he left, Mazel Tov, she gave birth. I don't know, right? It's the Gemara says, and Rava said, no, it's not a problem. It's her husband's child. Kiman kirebi da'amar mishtahe. Because like Rebbe, who says that sometimes the fetus could remain in the uterus, could remain in the womb for an extended amount of time. So it's actually pretty wild. So Rebbe said, this is the child that belongs to the first husband. She must have conceived before he left, but the baby just stuck around for another 3 months inside. To which the Gemara says, Kevan de ikar b'shem megamlil da'amar mishtai ki Rabbi Mavad. The same b'shem megamlil omer, kol shesha lamid yom ba'adam eino nefel. Shabbos said, then the Gemara says, but since there is the opinion of Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi said, Rabbi Gamliel ultimately holds as follows. He holds, Rabbi say, see, the Brisa said that if you have a baby born during the 8th month, its viability is only determined when, it's fascinating, when the baby reaches the age of 20. Not 20 days, not 20 months, not 20, right? 20 years old. To which the Gemara says, okay, but first of all, it's just strange in general because that you would have such a large window. But more than I will say, this is Rabbi Shmuel holds that halacha l'maisa. Anytime a baby is born, viability is determined when? After 30 days. Once the baby survives 30 days, that baby is Yotze Michlal Nefel. It's no longer a Nefel, and it is considered to be an absolutely viable baby. Which Shabbos say, halacha l'maisa is very important. Rachmana litzlan, that is why if a child dies within 30 days, right, the halacha is there's no obligation of shiva or any type of formal mourning for such a child, because a child that passes away within 30 days is considered to be non-viable. But halacha l'maisa, once the baby reaches the 30-day threshold, that is when viability is established. Rabbi will say, let's get back to Sris. Rabbi will say, but remember again, halacha l'maisa, what we do accept, Rabbi will say, is as follows, that essentially, you can't call someone a Sris, you can't designate someone a Sris until when? It sounds like what the Gemara is saying is until the age of 20, right? 20 for a man, 20 for a woman, like we pass like Beisal on both accounts. And once there's 20 and no signs of physical maturation, that means there's a Sris. Sris, islandess. Rabbi say, why is that important? Because now what could we do? We could actually back up that status retroactively. So it turns out that this man wasn't a late bloomer, he's a Sris. And therefore, ultimately, again, when could we extend his Sriskite back until retroactively until where? To 13 years old, right? This girl is not a late bloomer, she's an islandess. When could we extend her islandess-kite back to the age of 12, which is important because then if they did Isurim during this time, there may be retroactive liability. Then I will say, all of this is assuming that the people in question, their issue is they have failed to produce signs of physical maturation. What about other signs? Well, here we go. Tana Rabbanan. Ezus Rischama. Rabbi will say, what's an example of a Srischama? Someone who's born in this state. Kol Shu Ben Esr V'lo Havishtei Saros. So Rabbi will say, so this is the classic example. Any man who's 20 years old, but has not produced any signs of physical maturation. Va'afilu hevi li'achar mikan. This is what I mentioned before, which is really dramatic. See, once you reach that age of 12, you have that designation of Sris. And even if at 21 he produces 2 hairs, the Gemara says we don't pay attention to it. Rabbi say, from the Gemara's perspective, it's almost as if once you reach a certain age and fail to produce signs of physical maturation, it's clear you're Sris. You produced 2 hairs at 21 years old. We just look at those 2 hairs as just something else. Just something else. The Eloin simani. Rabbi say, here are the simanim of a Sris. Here we go. Kol she'en lo zakan. Rabbi say, any person that doesn't have a beard. Usa'ara lakui. Rabbi say, interesting. His hair is for a man. He has very soft hair. Very soft hair. Ubisara machlik. And he has very soft skin. Rabbi say, the common denominator over here is these are considered to be feminine attributes. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda ben Yair. Kol she'en meimav ma'alin resichos. If when he urinates, his urine does not create a foam. Okay? No arc, is what we said before. Urinates, no arc. Or any man whose shichvas zara, semen is liquidy. Others say it's anyone whose urine, we'll say machmitzin literally means becomes machmitzin means like vinegar. It becomes putrefy. Good, putrefy. All right. Again, I'm not sure. I always thought that urine was putrefied, but I guess not. All right, I guess right. For a while, it's still good. Right. So lamais again, machmitzin. Right. It becomes putrefied. The achirim say kol sherochetz bimos hagisham ve'misar malaheva. Interesting. Whoever bathed during the winter, but his skin does not emit steam. So Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer Kol Shekolo Lakui Ve'eno Nikar Ben Ish Isha, or any man whose voice is so high pitched that when you hear him speak, you don't know if it's a man or a woman. So we'll say these are all the simanim. Now we'll say what we're going to see is something very interesting, which is that halacha l'maisa is the Gemara suggesting you need all of these simanim, one of these simanim. Again, we'll get to that, but l'maisa, these are the simanim. Vezu islandess, and we'll say who's an islandess? Kol shi basas of lo heavy base saros. So we'll say any woman who's 20 years old did not produce signs of physical maturation. We'll say it's wild again. Even if she produces physical signs later on, again, once her status is established at the age of 20, that status does not change. And ultimately, again, these are the simanim of an islandess. Kol she'in la dadayim. Any woman who does not have breasts, she doesn't physically develop, and relations are difficult, I will say physically painful for her. There seems to also be an indication, ultimately, of a lack of physical maturation. Any woman who doesn't have the general physical formula, I will say, the Gemara calls it shipulim ayim, which means the stomach slants inward towards the makom erva. So any woman who doesn't have the build of a woman, right, ultimately again is like an island. Any woman whose voice is very deep, and so deep that again you can't tell the difference if it's a man or a woman, ultimately that would be indicative of an island. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up a Bernhard session with the discussion about whether or not one needs all of these simanim or even one or some of these simanim. Shkoyach.